Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the complete story of Malenia, Blade of Miquella. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and which games you'd like me to cover next. If you're enjoying these peaceful journeys, don't forget to subscribe so you catch every new video. But for now, let's get cozy and journey through the complete story of Malenia. Among all the legends whispered throughout the lands between, few names carry the weight of both reverence and dread quite like Malenia. She is the warrior who has never known defeat, the Blade of Miquella, and eventually the goddess of rot itself. Her story reaches back to the very foundations of the Golden Order, woven through with threads of devotion, curse, and an unbreakable bond with her twin brother. Tonight, we will trace every step of her journey, from the moment of her cursed birth to her final transformation into something beyond mortality. We'll explore the depths of the scarlet rot that ravaged her body, the desperate measures her brother took to save her, and the catastrophic battle that scarred an entire region of the lands between. Pour yourself something warm, settle into comfort, and prepare yourself for a tale that spans the rise and fall of demigods, the corruption of entire kingdoms, and the unwavering love between siblings born under the shadow of an ancient curse. Our tale begins not with Malenia herself, but with her parents, two figures whose union would shape the destiny of the lands between in ways no one could have anticipated. Queen Marika the Eternal stood as the vessel of the Elden Ring, the embodiment of the greater will's power in the mortal realm. She was more than a queen. She was a god made flesh, her golden hair a symbol of divine authority that had endured for ages beyond counting. Beside her stood Radagon of the Golden Order, her second Elden Lord, a warrior of unmatched prowess who had once been wed to Queen Renala of the Academy before forsaking that union to join with Marika. Their marriage seemed blessed by the very heavens, a union of two beings of immense power who would surely produce heirs worthy of carrying forward the Golden Order's eternal reign. But the truth, as it so often does in the lands between, proved far more complex and troubling than appearances suggested. Marika and Radagon were not simply husband and wife. They were two aspects of the same being, a single god split into separate bodies. This strange duality remained hidden from most, a secret known only to the most learned scholars and those who had gazed too deeply into the mysteries of the Elden Ring itself. When children are born of such a union, when a single god produces offspring with itself, the natural order strains and twists in ways that defy comprehension. The very laws that govern mortality and divinity bend beneath the weight of such an impossibility, and something must inevitably give way. Into this paradox, Malenia and her elder twin brother Miquella were born, and from their very first breath, the price of their parents' impossible nature became horrifyingly clear. The records kept by the two fingers, those enigmatic servants of the greater will who guide the Golden Order, identified both children as Empyreans. This designation marked them as beings of extraordinary potential, candidates who possessed the inherent capacity to one day replace their mother as vessels for the Elden Ring, to become gods in their own right and usher in new ages according to their own visions. Such status should have been a blessing beyond measure, a guarantee of power and purpose that few in all of history could claim. But the curse that accompanied this potential would overshadow any glory their divine heritage might have promised. Miquella's affliction manifested as eternal childhood, his body and voice forever locked in youth regardless of how many years passed, or how much wisdom and power he accumulated within that unchanging form. It was a cruel mockery of immortality, denying him the physical growth that would allow him to fully realize his potential, keeping him perpetually dependent even as his mind expanded to encompass knowledge that would humble the greatest scholars. But Malenia's curse proved even more immediately terrible in its manifestation. From the moment she drew her first breath, the scarlet rot writhed within her flesh, an incurable affliction that began consuming her body from within. This was no ordinary disease that physicians might treat with herbs or incantations. This was the mark of an outer god, a cosmic entity whose very essence was decay and corruption, choosing Malenia as its vessel in the mortal realm. The outer god of rot exists as one of the most terrifying forces that influence the lands between from beyond the veil of normal reality. Unlike the greater will, which imposed order and structure through its Elden Ring, the god of rot embodied a different kind of natural law, the inevitable cycle of decay and rebirth that turns all living things eventually to fertile soil. Its power wasn't simply destruction for destruction's sake, but rather a representation of how death feeds new life, how corruption creates the conditions for renewal. In the underground ruins beneath the lands between, in places where ancient civilizations once thrived before being consumed and forgotten, the servants of this god had built temples and performed rituals that would chill the blood of any sane individual. They worshipped decay itself, allowed mushrooms to grow from their living flesh as holy vestments that rooted them to the earth, and spoke in ecstatic tones of the beautiful cycle that would reduce all the works of the Golden Order to fertile rot. Long ago, in ages beyond the reach of memory or written record, this outer god of rot had held terrible sway over the lands between. Entire regions had fallen to its influence, transformed into festering wastelands where normal life could not endure. The rot spread like a plague wherever it touched, corrupting flesh and driving those infected to madness as it ate away at their minds along with their bodies. But then came a figure whose deeds would be remembered in legend, even if his name was lost to time. The blind swordsman, clad in blue cloth that symbolized flowing water, received from a fairy a curved blade patterned after the rushing of rivers. With this weapon in hand, he ventured into the deepest places beneath the world, following the Ainsel River down into darkness until he reached the Lake of Rot itself, where the god's divine essence pooled in stagnant corruption. The battle that followed defied normal comprehension. A mortal warrior facing down a force of cosmic decay, armed with nothing but a blade, and the philosophy that stagnation leads to corruption, while flowing water remains pure. Somehow, through means that remain mysterious even in legend, the blind swordsman prevailed. He sealed the outer god's essence in that underground lake, containing its power behind barriers both physical and mystical. The waters of that place would remain forever tainted, a scarlet pool where nothing wholesome could grow. But the god's ability to spread its influence across the surface world was broken. The threat was neutralized, or so it seemed. The people of the lands between could breathe easier, knowing that this particular cosmic horror had been bound away where it could harm no one. But outer gods are not so easily defeated, and their influence can manifest in unexpected ways even when their primary essence remains sealed. When Malenia was born, the god of rot somehow established a connection to her. Whether this occurred through the paradox of her birth from a single god, through some weakness in the ancient seals that bound it, or simply because her status as an Empyrean made her a natural vessel for divine power, the texts do not say. The rot took root in her infant body with vicious certainty, and from that day forward, it would be her constant companion and greatest enemy. The affliction ravaged her without mercy, spreading through her flesh like fire through dried tinder. Over time, portions of her body succumbed completely to the rot's advance. Her right arm was lost, as was her left leg and the lower portion of her right leg. Even her eyes, those windows to the soul, were consumed by the corruption until she was rendered blind. Golden prosthetics replaced her missing limbs, crafted with exquisite skill, but they could never be truly the same as what she had lost. The pain must have been unimaginable, not just the physical agony of flesh slowly dying while still attached to a living body, but the psychological torment of feeling something alien and hostile living inside you, constantly pushing to spread further, to consume more. Every breath Malenia took brought her closer to total corruption. Every heartbeat pumped the rot a little deeper into tissues that hadn't yet surrendered to its influence. And there was no cure, no remedy that the physicians of the Golden Order could devise that would drive out an outer god's essence once it had taken root. The greatest minds of the age studied her condition, searched through ancient texts, performed experimental treatments that left her screaming in agony, and all of it accomplished nothing. The rot could not be cured. It could only be endured. But Malenia did not face this burden alone. Her twin brother Michela, cursed with his own form of suffering, dedicated himself entirely to finding some way to save his sister from the fate that awaited her. While others saw her as pitiable or dangerous, a vessel for corruption that perhaps should be put down before she could spread her affliction to others, Michela saw only his beloved sister, and he would move heaven and earth if necessary to ease her suffering. His intellect, already formidable despite his youthful appearance, focused with laser intensity on the problem before him. He studied the nature of outer gods, seeking to understand how their influence could be countered, or at least contained. He researched ancient materials and crafting techniques, looking for substances that could resist divine corruption. And in his workshops hidden within the developing Halic tree, he labored tirelessly over forges and anvils, determined to create something that could give Malenia a fighting chance. The breakthrough came with unalloyed gold, a substance of Michela's own devising that possessed remarkable properties. Unlike the gold associated with the Golden Order, which was ultimately a tool of the greater will, and therefore unable to truly stand against another outer god's power, unalloyed gold existed independent of any divine influence. It was pure in a way that transcended the normal meaning of that word, incorruptible at a fundamental level that allowed it to resist the meddling of outer gods. Michela shaped this remarkable material into a needle, delicate as a pin, but stronger than the mightiest blade, and this needle he drove into Malenia's flesh. The effect was immediate and miraculous. The rot's advance slowed, its inexorable spread checked by the presence of something it could not corrupt or overcome. The needle didn't cure Malenia, didn't drive out the god's essence that had taken root in her, but it bought her time, gave her a reprieve from the constant advancement of her decay. With the needle in place, Malenia could function almost as a normal person, train as a warrior, live something approaching a normal life despite her prosthetic limbs and sightless eyes. The rot remained within her, always present, always hungry, but contained behind barriers of unalloyed gold that would hold as long as the needle remained intact and properly positioned. The golden prosthetics that replaced her missing limbs were masterworks of craftsmanship, and while their creator remains uncertain in the historical record, it seems likely they were connected to Michela's work with unalloyed gold. These replacements moved with the same fluidity and precision as natural flesh and bone, so perfectly balanced and responsive that Malenia could wield them as effectively as her original limbs had been. Her right arm in particular would later house the blade that would make her famous, a golden katana of breathtaking length and sharpness that seemed almost a natural extension of her body rather than a separate weapon. The bond between the twins during this period of their early lives cannot be overstated. Michela poured all his considerable intellect and power into helping his sister, creating innovations in medicine and metallurgy that would have applications far beyond just treating her condition. And Malenia, for her part, dedicated herself to becoming her brother's protector, his sworn blade who would stand between him and any threat the world might present. They became known as the twin prodigies, two Empyreans whose combined potential seemed limitless despite the curses that afflicted them. Where others saw weakness and deformity, they saw strength tempered by adversity, wisdom born of suffering. And in the private moments when no one else was watching, they simply saw each other, siblings bound by love and shared affliction, into a relationship deeper than most mortals could comprehend. But even with the needle's protection, even with her brother's unwavering support, Malenia knew that containing the rot was not enough. If she wished to live a full life, to fulfill her purpose as an Empyrean and stand as her brother's blade, she would need more than just magical prosthetics and temporary measures. She would need to become strong enough that the rot within her could not define her existence, skilled enough that her blindness and missing limbs would become advantages rather than weaknesses. She would need to transform herself into a weapon of such perfection that nothing in the lands between could stand against her, because only through absolute mastery of the martial arts could she hope to control her own fate, rather than being swept along by the currents of decay that constantly threatened to overwhelm her. Her salvation came in the form of another legendary figure, one whose story was intimately connected to the very force that afflicted her. The blind swordsman who had sealed the outer god of rot ages ago still walked the lands between, or perhaps he had trained apprentices who carried on his techniques and philosophy. The details remain unclear across the centuries, but what matters is that Malenia encountered this figure, or his teachings, at a crucial point in her development. The master who had defeated the god of rot itself agreed to take her as his student, to teach her the flowing techniques that had allowed him to triumph over cosmic corruption. Some might wonder why he would train the very vessel of the god he had fought so hard to seal away. But the blind swordsman understood something fundamental about the nature of water and rot, about stagnation and flow. His philosophy held that still waters inevitably grow foul, that anything which stops moving eventually decays. But flowing water, water that constantly moves and renews itself, remains pure no matter how long it runs. The rot thrived in stagnation, in flesh that remained static and unchanging until corruption could take root. But if Malenia could learn to move with the fluidity of rushing water, if she could embody flow itself in her combat style, then perhaps she could resist the rot's influence through sheer kinetic denial. Every moment she spent in motion, every fluid transition from stance to attack to defense, would be a moment where the rot found no purchase, no static foundation from which to spread. It was a philosophy born of desperation but grounded in profound understanding of the forces at play. The training was grueling beyond anything Malenia had experienced before. The blind swordsman did not coddle his students or make allowances for disabilities. If anything, he pushed Malenia harder precisely because of her blindness and prosthetic limbs, demanding that she transcend these limitations entirely, rather than simply working around them. She learned to read the flow of air across her skin, to sense the displacement of space when an opponent moved, to hear the subtle shifts in breathing and weight distribution that telegraphed incoming attacks. Her prosthetic arm became an extension of her will, responding to her intentions with mechanical precision that surpassed what organic muscle and sinew could achieve. The golden metal that replaced her limbs was harder than bone, could endure impacts that would shatter natural arms and legs, and never tired no matter how long the battle raged. But more than physical conditioning, what the blind swordsman taught her was a mindset, a way of approaching combat that transcended mere technique. He showed her how to flow like water, to adapt to any situation with fluid grace rather than meeting force with rigid resistance. When an enemy attacked high, she learned to flow low. When they committed to a powerful strike, she learned to redirect that force rather than absorbing it. Every movement flowed into the next with seamless continuity, creating combinations that seemed to have no beginning or end, just eternal motion that swept opponents away like debris in a flood. She learned the guard counter, the art of allowing an opponent to strike so that their commitment to the attack left them vulnerable to a precisely timed riposte. She learned to read combat like a rushing river reads the landscape, finding the path of least resistance and following it with inexorable certainty. And from these teachings, combined with her own desperate need and fierce determination, Malenia developed what would become her signature technique, an attack so devastating and beautiful that its very name would be spoken with awe and dread throughout the lands between. The waterfowl dance, a flurry of strikes that seemed to defy the laws of physics and human motion. She would launch herself into the air, her body spinning with the grace of a dancer and the lethality of a hurricane, her blade becoming a golden blur that struck from every angle simultaneously. The attack came in waves, each barrage flowing seamlessly into the next, giving opponents no time to recover or mount a defense. It was water made into cutting edges, flow given murderous form, and it embodied everything her master had taught her about remaining in constant motion. Through years of dedicated training under the blind swordsman's tutelage, Malenia transformed herself from a cursed and crippled child into something approaching perfection in the martial arts. Her blindness became an advantage. forcing her to develop senses that sighted warriors never bothered to hone. Her prosthetic limbs granted her strength and endurance beyond what natural flesh could provide. The rot within her, contained by her brother's needle but always present, became a source of desperate motivation that drove her to heights of skill that more comfortable warriors would never reach. She emerged from her training as a warrior without peer, someone who had literally never lost a battle, whose blade could match any opponent's and whose technique had been refined to a degree that bordered on supernatural. During this period of growth and development, while Malenia trained her body and Miquella researched solutions to their curses, the Golden Order maintained its seemingly eternal reign over the lands between. Queen Marika sat upon her throne within the Erd Tree, the Elden Ring's power flowing through her to maintain the laws of reality as the greater will decreed them. It must have seemed to most that this golden age would continue forever, that the order established by Marika would endure for eons uncounted. But cracks had begun to form in the foundation of this eternal empire, tensions and resentments that festered in darkness, waiting for the right moment to erupt into open conflict. And that moment would come with terrible swiftness, triggered by an assassination that shattered the illusion of invulnerability that surrounded the demigod children of Queen Marika. The Night of Black Knives, as it would come to be known, saw assassins wielding blades imbued with the rune of death itself strike down Godwyn the Golden, firstborn of Queen Marika, and perhaps the most beloved of all her children. He who had befriended dragons, who embodied the highest ideals of the Golden Order, was murdered in his bed while darkness held sway over the capital. His death was not clean or complete. His soul was slain while his body lived on, creating an abomination that would become known as the Prince of Death, a spreading corruption that twisted life itself into grotesque mockery. Their assassination appears to have shattered something fundamental in Queen Marika's psyche. Her reasons for what came next remain debated by scholars, whether driven by grief, rage, or some deeper purpose that she carried hidden even from her closest counselors. She did the unthinkable. She raised a hammer and brought it down upon the Elden Ring itself, shattering the symbol and source of her divine authority into fragments. The shattering of the Elden Ring sent shockwaves through reality itself. Laws that had governed existence for time beyond memory suddenly became flexible and uncertain. The Golden Order's carefully maintained structure began to crumble, and Marika, for her act of cosmic vandalism, was imprisoned within the Erd Tree itself, crucified upon the rune of death as punishment for her transgression. Her consort Radagon, being ultimately another aspect of the same being, was imprisoned alongside her, leaving the throne of the lands between suddenly and catastrophically empty. With no god to channel the Elden Ring's power and no Elden Lord to enforce their will, the carefully maintained peace of the Golden Order collapsed almost overnight. The fragments of the shattered Elden Ring, called Great Runes, scattered across the lands between, drawn to beings of sufficient power and significance to serve as their vessels. Marika's children, demigods all, each received such a shard, becoming shard-bearers whose very existence now tied them to the broken remnants of cosmic authority. Malenia received her great rune, and its description carries ominous implications that even in the midst of catastrophe, scholars and mystics recognize something significant about her particular shard. The The text claimed that, as daughter to both Marika and Radagon, Malenia's great rune should have been the most sacred of all, suggesting some special significance or power that her rune possessed above and beyond those granted to her siblings. What made Malenia's great rune particularly sacred remains somewhat mysterious. Perhaps it related to her status as an Empyrean, one of the few beings capable of replacing Marika as a god. Perhaps the paradox of her birth from a single god split into two aspects imbued her rune with unique properties. Or perhaps the fact that she harbored an outer god's essence within her flesh, contained but not destroyed, meant that her rune resonated with powers beyond the greater will's normal influence. Whatever the reason, Malenia now carried a fragment of cosmic authority within her being, adding to the already complex mix of divine and cursed elements that made up her existence. But Marika's final message to her children, delivered through mysterious means before her imprisonment became complete, set the stage for the wars that would consume the lands between for the next age. She spoke to each of her shard-bearer children, demigods and Empyreans all, telling them to make of themselves what they desired, to become lords or gods according to their own ambitions. But she added a chilling corollary. Those who failed to become anything, those who did not seize power and make something of their divine potential, would be forsaken entirely, amounting to nothing more than sacrifices to feed the ambitions of their more successful siblings. It was both permission and command, a declaration that the old order had ended and that what came next would be determined by whoever proved strong enough to claim it. The wars that followed this proclamation would come to be known simply as the Shattering, as if the breaking of the Elden Ring had broken everything else along with it. Demigods who had once been siblings, or at least cousins bound by their shared divine heritage, turned on each other with vicious abandon. Each shard-bearer sought to claim the great runes held by the others, believing that gathering enough fragments might allow them to restore the Elden Ring under their own authority, to become the new god of a new age shaped according to their own vision. Armies marched across the lands between, burning villages and besieging castles. Ancient alliances crumbled as ambition overrode loyalty. And in the midst of this chaos, Malenia made a choice that would define her role in the conflict to come. Where some shard-bearers sought the throne out of naked ambition or desire for power, Malenia's motivation was more focused and personal. She fought not for herself but for her brother Miquella, whose wisdom and compassion she believed made him uniquely suited to become the next god. Miquella's vision for the lands between promised relief for the oppressed and abandoned, for those whom the Golden Order had cast aside as unworthy. His Halig tree, grown from a sapling watered with his own blood, already served as a sanctuary for the Albinaurics, misbegotten, and other creatures that the old order had deemed impure or unacceptable. If Miquella could ascend to true godhood, if he could claim enough great runes to remake the Elden Ring, according to his own gentle philosophy, then perhaps the lands between could know an age of mercy rather than domination. For this cause, for her brother's dream of a kinder world, Malenia would become a conquering warrior, the likes of which the lands between had rarely seen. She gathered to herself an army of clean-rot knights, warriors who knew full well that serving her meant inevitable exposure to the scarlet rot that seeped constantly from her body despite Miquella's needle. These knights took an oath knowing it was effectively a death sentence, that their flesh would gradually rot away as they fought beside their chosen lady, that they would die in agony as the corruption consumed them from within. Yet they swore their loyalty anyway, drawn by something in Malenia that inspired devotion beyond rational self-interest. Perhaps they believed in Miquella's vision as fervently as she did. Perhaps they saw in Malenia's own struggle against her curse a nobility worth dying for. Or perhaps they simply recognized that she would never ask them to endure anything she hadn't already suffered herself. The Cleanrot Knights would become legendary in their own right. Warriors whose armor bore the insignia of intertwined dome and tree, whose capes displayed the symbol of Miquella's halig tree with 9 fruits and 5 moth-like blooms. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that every battle might be their last as the rot gradually claimed their bodies. Their armor gradually became prisons of flesh and metal, the rot bursting through gaps in plate and chain, sprouting wing-like growths and tendril extensions that betrayed how far the corruption had advanced. Yet they fought on, some eventually becoming so consumed by rot that they could barely be called human anymore, hunched and twisted into shapes that should not be able to move, let alone fight. Their loyalty to Malenia, and through her to Miquella, never wavered, a testament to the charismatic power that the twin prodigies wielded despite their curses. With this devoted army at her back, Malenia marched south from the halig tree, descending from the northern reaches of the lands between down the Bellum Highway. Her campaign was methodical and devastating in equal measure. A carefully planned military operation designed to systematically eliminate rival shard-bearers and claim their great runes for Miquella's eventual ascension. Village after village fell before her advance, not always through direct violence but through the simple fear that her approach inspired. Stories of the blade of Miquella had spread throughout the lands between, tales of a blind warrior who had never known defeat, whose blade moved with fluid grace that made mockery of the most skilled opponent's defenses. Few wished to test whether they might be the first bester in combat. The first major confrontation of her southern campaign brought Malenia's forces into conflict with Godric the Grafted, a distant relation who ruled over Stormvale Castle. Godric was a pathetic figure in many ways, a demigod who felt his own power insufficient and thus sought to literally graft the limbs and body parts of defeated warriors onto his own flesh, building himself into a grotesque patchwork giant. He had some skill with the blade despite his monstrous appearance, and his position commanding Stormvale gave him strategic importance that Malenia could not ignore. When her army approached his gates, Godric apparently made the catastrophic error of insulting her, perhaps thinking that mockery of her blindness or prosthetic limbs might somehow gain him psychological advantage. The battle that followed was utterly one-sided, more a demonstration of the gulf between genuine martial mastery and crude power than an actual contest. Malenia cut through Godric's forces with the same fluid grace she brought to all combat, her blade rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost choreographed in their precision. The Cleanrot Knights swept aside resistance with disciplined efficiency, their loyalty and training overcoming whatever advantages Godric's grafted abominations might have possessed. And when Malenia finally stood before Godric himself, when her blade met his in direct confrontation, the so-called Lord of Stormvale found himself utterly outmatched. She humbled him completely, reducing the proud demigod to a groveling wretch who begged for mercy at her feet. Malenia could have killed him then, could have taken his great rune and added it to her brother's collection. That she chose not to, that she accepted his surrender and allowed him to live on as a defeated and humiliated vassal, speaks to something in her character that the simple label of conquering warrior doesn't fully capture. Despite her skill in violence, despite the curse that marked her as a vessel for decay and death, Malenia wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. She fought for her brother's vision of a gentler age, and in that service, she tried to minimize unnecessary slaughter, where her goals could be achieved through decisive victory followed by mercy. Godric would remain as he was, grafting more limbs in desperate attempts to make himself strong enough that he would never again have to feel the shame of groveling before another. Victory followed victory as Malenia's campaign continued south. Other shard-bearers either fell to her blade or wisely chose not to contest her passage. Her reputation grew with each triumph, spreading ahead of her army like a bow wave, so that even proud and powerful demigods thought twice before directly opposing her advance. She remained undefeated, just as she had been throughout her training under the blind swordsman, and each success seemed to prove that not even the curses of birth could limit someone with sufficient skill and determination. The Clean Rot Knights, though their numbers gradually dwindled as the rot claimed more of them, remained fiercely loyal and effective. And back in the Haligtree, Miquella continued his own work, labouring to grow his new tree into something that could rival the Erdtree itself, preparing the foundation for the gentle age his sister was fighting to secure. But the campaign could not continue unopposed forever. Eventually, inevitably, Malenia's southern march brought her forces into direct confrontation with the one demigod whose military might and personal power most closely matched her own. General Radahn, the Star Scourge, half-brother to Malenia through their shared parent Radagon, ruled over the wasteland of Caelid with an iron fist and commanded an army of Redmane warriors who revered him as the mightiest general the lands between had ever produced. Where Malenia embodied fluid grace and technique refined to perfection, Radahn represented raw power and gravitational mastery taken to their absolute limits. He had learned gravity magic from an ancient alabaster lord, magic that allowed him to manipulate the forces that held the cosmos together. He had used this power to literally hold back the stars themselves, arresting their movement through the heavens for reasons both practical and symbolic. The confrontation between these two legendary warriors had been brewing since the shattering began. They represented different philosophies, different approaches to power, and served different visions of what the lands between should become. Radahn, for all his might, served no particular ideal beyond his own glory, and perhaps some obscure promise made to Miquella before the shattering began. Malenia served her brother's dream of a gentler age, but more immediately, she needed Radahn's great rune, needed to eliminate him as a rival shard-bearer who could threaten Miquella's eventual ascension. And there may have been personal elements at play as well. The complex dynamics of a family torn apart by ambition and competing loyalties, half-siblings who might have been allies in a different world, but found themselves on opposite sides of an irreconcilable conflict. Their armies met in the heart of Caelid, a region that was already harsh and unforgiving before the battle began, where the ground ran red with natural iron deposits and hardy creatures eked out existence in badlands that would kill softer beings. The Street of Sages, where learned scholars had once practiced gravity sorcery under Radan's patronage, became ground zero for what would be remembered as one of the most catastrophic battles in the entire Shattering. Cleanrot knights in their deteriorating armour faced off against Redmane soldiers mounted on their hardy steeds, while Malenia and Radan themselves met in single combat surrounded by the carnage of their followers' struggles. The duel between these two champions of their respective causes must have been something to witness, though few who saw it survived to tell the tale. Radan, massive beyond mortal scale, his body enlarged by gravity magic and constant consumption of corpses on the battlefield, wielding two colossal swords and riding a horse so small beneath his bulk that it seemed impossible the creature could support him at all. And Malenia, seeming almost fragile in comparison, her slender frame supported by golden prosthetics, her single blade held with casual grace that disguised the lethal precision behind every movement. They fought with everything they possessed, technique meeting raw power in a collision that sent shockwaves through the battlefield. Malenia's waterfowl dance cut through the air in golden arcs, her blade finding gaps in Radan's defenses with surgical precision. But Radan's gravity magic allowed him to manipulate momentum itself, pulling Malenia toward his massive blades or creating crushing forces that would have flattened a lesser warrior. They fought for hours, perhaps days, time losing meaning as the battle raged on. The ground beneath their feet cracked and broke from the forces being unleashed. Lesser fighters who ventured too close to their duel were cut down by the mere aftershocks of their clashes. And slowly, agonizingly, it became clear that neither could gain a decisive advantage over the other. They were too well matched, Malenia's skill meeting Radan's power in a stalemate that threatened to continue indefinitely. But Malenia carried within her a weapon of last resort, one she had sworn never to use if any other option remained available. The scarlet rot that Miquella's needle held at bay, the outer god's essence that writhed constantly within her flesh, represented a power that could turn the tide of any battle if she was willing to pay the terrible price its use demanded. Everything her brother had worked for, everything she had trained for under the blind swordsman's tutelage, had been aimed at controlling and resisting the rot's influence. To unleash it deliberately would be to abandon all that effort, to give the outer god exactly what it wanted by allowing its corruption to spread unchecked. It would mean accepting that she could not win through skill and honor alone, could not meet Radan's measure through martial prowess, without resorting to the curse that defined her existence. And yet, as the battle dragged on, and no victory appeared forthcoming through conventional means, Malenia found herself facing an impossible choice. She could continue fighting indefinitely, hoping that Radan would eventually make a fatal error, or that her superior technique would gradually wear down his defenses. But every moment the stalemate continued, more of her loyal Cleanrot knights were dying around her, and the campaign to secure great runes for Miquella's ascension was stalled. Or she could do the unthinkable, could shatter the unalloyed gold needle that kept her rot contained and unleash the full force of the outer god's power that had been building up inside her since birth. It would guarantee victory, would eliminate Radan as a rival shard-bearer, but at a cost that made her hesitate even in the midst of desperate combat. In the end, whether driven by desperation, tactical calculation, or some deeper influence from the outer god itself, Malenia made her choice. The unalloyed gold needle that had protected her for so long was broken, though whether she shattered it deliberately or whether it broke during the intensity of combat remains a matter of scholarly debate. Regardless of how it happened, the rot that had been contained for so long suddenly surged free within her body. The transformation was immediate and terrible. Her flesh began to twist and change, rot spreading from her core in visible waves, and from her body burst the scarlet Aeonia, a manifestation of the outer god's power that took the form of a massive flower blooming with impossible speed and beauty. If one could find beauty in corruption made manifest, the bloom itself was like a tactical nuke made of pure decay. Scarlet energies exploded outward from Malenia's position, consuming everything they touched, spreading the rot in a wave that would eventually transform all of Caelid into a festering wasteland. Radan, standing at the epicenter of this explosion, took the full force of it directly. The rot poured over him, into him, through every gap in his armor and every breath he drew. His soldiers died by the thousands, their flesh rotting from their bones, even as they tried to flee the impossible devastation. The Street of Sages was consumed entirely, replaced by what would come to be known as the Swamp of Aeonia, a scarlet bog where nothing wholesome could grow, and where the servants of rot would eventually build their twisted places of worship. But even as the scarlet Aeonia bloomed and victory seemed assured, Malenia paid her own terrible price. The act of blooming, of allowing the outer god's power to express itself fully through her flesh, pushed her past some critical threshold. This was her first bloom, what ancient prophecies had warned would be the first of 3 transformations. The experience left her fundamentally changed. Her body, already ravaged by years of fighting the rot's advance, simply could not sustain consciousness after channeling such cosmic energies. She collapsed into a comatose state, her breathing shallow, her body beginning to undergo changes that suggested she was transforming into something no longer quite human. In that moment, before consciousness fled entirely, as the scarlet Aeonia's energies were still spreading and Radan stood before her infected but not yet fallen, Malenia leaned close and whispered something in her half-brother's ear. According to later accounts pieced together from various sources, she told him that Miquella awaited him, called him the promised consort, words whose full significance would only become apparent with the revelations that emerged from the shadow of the Erd Tree. Whether she spoke out of genuine understanding of her brother's plans, or whether something else guided her words in that crucial moment, remains open to interpretation. The aftermath of the Battle of Aeonia was catastrophic for everyone involved. Radan survived the rot's infection, his great rune and his immense strength providing resistance against complete dissolution. But the scarlet rot worked its destruction in a different way, consuming his mind and personality, everything that made him the mighty general he had been. He devolved into a feral shadow of his former self, a mindless giant who wandered the wastelands of Caelid, consuming any corpses he could find, maintaining just enough instinct to remain on the battlefield where he had fallen. His loyal red-maned soldiers, those who survived the initial bloom, dedicated themselves to containing the rot spread, using fire to burn away infected vegetation and creatures in a desperate attempt to prevent all of Caelid from being consumed entirely. They would fight this losing battle for years, unable to restore their beloved general, but too loyal to abandon their posts. Malenia's clean-rot knights found themselves in equally dire straits. The Scarlet Ionia had infected them as thoroughly as it had infected Radan's forces, and now the rot that had been gradually consuming them accelerated to horrifying speeds. Yet even as their bodies failed and twisted, even as they felt their minds beginning to slip under the influence of the corruption, many remained devoted to their fallen lady. One in particular, a knight named Finlay, performed an act of heroism that would be remembered for as long as any records of the shattering survived. She found Malenia's comatose form in the aftermath of the bloom, lifted her fallen commander onto her back, and began the long journey back to the Haligtree. The trek Finlay undertook defies easy comprehension. Malenia, even in her weakened state, was no light burden, and the journey from Caelid to the Haligtree covered hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Every region Finlay passed through was contested ground where the Shattering's wars still raged. Bandits, monsters, and soldiers from rival factions would have seen a lone knight carrying a comatose demigod as an easy target or a valuable prize to be claimed. Yet Finlay fought off all threats, defended her slumbering lady against every assault, never once setting down her burden or considering abandoning the mission. Days turned to weeks, weeks perhaps to months, as the knight pressed onward with single-minded determination. The rot consuming her own body made each step more agonizing than the last, her strength failing even as her will remained unbreakable. When Finlay finally reached the Haligtree, when she delivered Malenia safely to the roots of her brother's great tree, she had accomplished something that seemed impossible. Against all odds, through superhuman determination and loyalty that transcended rational thought, she had saved the blade of Miquella from certain death on the fields of Caelid. Finlay's ultimate fate remains unclear. Whether she survived long enough to see Malenia settled in her resting place, or whether the final dregs of her strength gave out the moment her duty was fulfilled. But her deed would not be forgotten, her essence captured in spirit ashes that would allow later generations to summon an echo of her unwavering devotion. Malenia was placed at the roots of the Haligtree, in the city of Elfale, that had grown around the base of Miquella's great tree, and there she sank into dreams, while those who remained hoped her condition might stabilize. The scarlet rot continued to seep from her body even in slumber, no longer contained by the needle that had been broken, gradually infecting the Haligtree itself with the same corruption that had devastated Caelid. The beautiful vision of a sanctuary for the oppressed and abandoned began to show signs of the rot's influence, though the tree proved more resilient than normal vegetation and resisted complete corruption. Clean rot knights and Haligtree soldiers maintained their posts, standing guard over their slumbering lady and waiting for Miquella to emerge from his cocoon and set things right. But Miquella would not emerge. While Malenia had been waging her campaign in the south, while she had been fighting Radan and using the Scarlet Ionia to secure victory, something terrible had happened back at the Haligtree. Moog, Lord of Blood, another of Queen Marika's cursed children born as an omen, had discovered Miquella's cocoon and become obsessed with the Empyrean who slumbered within. Mog worshipped the formless mother, an outer god whose essence was blood and whose power promised to elevate him to godhood if only he could find a suitable consort to share that ascension. And Miquella, despite his eternal youth, possessed power and potential that made him perfect for Morg's purposes. The Lord of Blood violated the Haligtree's sanctuary, reached into the heart of the tree where Miquella had encased himself to grow and cure his curse, and tore the cocoon free. He spirited Miquella away to Mogwin Palace, his underground realm where blood cultists performed rituals in the formless mother's name. There, Mog attempted to elevate Miquella to godhood through ceremonies that involved bathing the cocoon in blood harvested from his cultists. Whether Mog acted of his own will or was charmed by Miquella's extraordinary power to compel affection became clearer only with later revelations, but at the time it appeared to be an abduction driven by the Lord of Blood's own ambitions. Malenia, sleeping at the Haligtree's roots, knew nothing of her brother's abduction. She dreamed deeply, her consciousness perhaps wandering in realms beyond normal understanding, while her body underwent slow transformation from the rot that now flowed freely through her veins. She awaited Miquella's return, confident that her brother would emerge from his cocoon healed and ready to ascend to godhood with the great runes she had helped secure. She did not know that she waited in vain, that the brother she loved and served would never walk through the Haligtree's halls again, at least not in any form she would recognize. The soldiers and knights who guarded her received no orders, no guidance, just the slowly spreading rot and their own loyalty to keep them at their posts. This state of affairs persisted for an indeterminate period. The shattering ground on, other shard-bearers fought and schemed and died, but the Haligtree remained isolated in the far north, protected by treacherous passes and the puzzle of Ordina liturgical town that had to be solved before the path to Miquella's sanctuary could be opened. Malenia slept, and the rot spread, and the dream of a gentler age faded like morning mist beneath the harsh light of reality, until finally, inevitably, a tarnished who had been touched by grace and called to seek the Elden Ring found their way to the consecrated snowfield and then to the Haligtree itself. The tarnished's journey through Elfale would have been harrowing, fighting through clean rot knights and Haligtree soldiers who defended their posts with the desperate ferocity of those who knew their cause was already lost, past Crystallians and pests and all manner of creatures that had taken refuge in Miquella's sanctuary before it became infected, down through branches and boulevards where the rot had warped the wood into nightmarish shapes, until finally, at the very bottom of the city, where the roots of the Haligtree dug deepest into the earth, the tarnished would find a site of grace marked as Haligtree roots, and just beyond that grace, down a short flight of stairs, they would find Malenia. The awakening itself was gentle at first, almost peaceful. Malenia rose from her slumber as if waking from pleasant dreams, her movements controlled and graceful, despite the rot that had been consuming her body while she slept. When she spoke, her voice carried neither hostility nor fear, just simple statement of fact tinged with something that might have been relief that someone finally worthy had come. She introduced herself with a phrase that would become infamous among those who challenged her. "I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and I have never known defeat." It was not boast or threat, merely truth stated plainly. She had never lost a battle, and she did not intend to start now, not even against a Tarnished who had overcome every challenge the lands between could present. The battle that followed tested everything the Tarnished had learned in their journey. Malenia's blade moved with the same fluid grace her mentor had taught her, each strike flowing into the next in combinations that gave no opening for counterattack. Her waterfowl dance filled the air with cutting edges, forcing the Tarnished to either flee in panic or find some way to avoid the barrage entirely. She could close distance in an instant, her prosthetic legs launching her across the arena with mechanical precision. And every strike she landed, even ones that were blocked or barely connected, siphoned away a portion of the Tarnished's vitality and added it to her own, her blade drinking life as hungrily as the rot drank flesh. The Tarnished, through skill or persistence, or perhaps just the blessing of grace that had called them to this impossible task, eventually managed to reduce Malenia's health to 0. For anyone else, this would have been the end, the conclusion of the battle and the claiming of victory. But Malenia's story was not so simple, could not end with a mere defeat in combat. As her body began to fail, as the Tarnished surely thought their ordeal complete, the scarlet rot within Malenia surged one final time. The second bloom began, the prophecy advancing one step closer to its ultimate conclusion. Wings burst from Malenia's back, vast and terrible, formed not of feathers but of butterflies held together by strands of her own hair. These Aeonian butterflies, creatures born from her corruption, lifted her into the air as her body completed its transformation into something beyond mortal flesh. She became Malenia, goddess of rot. The curse her brother had fought so hard to contain now embraced fully and turned into power that transcended human limits. The second phase of her battle began, her attacks now leaving pools of rot that would gradually consume anyone standing in them. Her movements even faster and more deadly than before, phantom versions of herself appearing to attack from unexpected angles. The battle raged on, Tarnished versus nascent goddess, until finally, impossibly, Malenia fell. Her body faded, dissolving into golden light as her strength finally gave out. In her last moments, as consciousness fled and death claimed her at last, she found breath to speak final words that carried all the weight of her life's devotion. She acknowledged the Tarnished strength, called them extraordinary, and marked them as a true lord. And then, as the end came, her thoughts turned where they had always turned, to the brother she had served without question. Oh dear Miquella, oh dearest Miquella, my brother, I'm sorry, I finally met my match. According to the lore preserved in the incantation that bears her name, this second blooming brought her one step closer to becoming a true goddess, with prophecies suggesting a third bloom would complete that transformation. With those words, Malenia's story came to its end, or perhaps to its transformation. Her body vanished entirely, leaving in its place a massive scarlet Aeonia, solid and permanent, a flower of rot that would bloom eternally at the base of the Halic tree. The Tarnished could approach this flower, could interact with it if they possessed certain items gained from completing quest lines related to Malenia's legacy, and they would take with them the remembrance of the rot goddess, which could be exchanged for either her signature katana, the Hand of Malenia, or the incantation that allowed them to unleash their own Scarlet Aeonia. But Malenia's influence extended beyond her own actions and the direct results of her battles. During her first blooming at Aeonia, when the scarlet rot had exploded outward in that massive wave of corruption, something unexpected occurred. From this bloom emerged 5 beings connected to Malenia in ways that scholars still debate, not born from her body in any conventional sense, but rather manifesting from the scarlet Aeonia itself, like offshoots or buds from the corruption. These figures, sometimes called Scarlet Valkyries, included Millicent, Pollyanna, Maureen, Amy, and Mary, each carrying within them a portion of essence linked to Malenia, along with the rot that defined her existence. Millicent in particular would become important to those seeking to understand Malenia's story. She wandered the lands between, afflicted by the rot, but fighting against it with fierce determination. A traveller might encounter her early in Caelid, find her suffering from the corruption's advance, and if they possessed the right tools, an unalloyed gold needle similar to what Miquella had crafted for Malenia, they could help stabilize her condition. Millicent's questline would eventually lead back to the Haligtree, drawn by something she felt needed to be returned to the one from whom she had emerged. Through her dialogue, it becomes clear she seeks to restore something intangible but crucial, speaking of returning Malenia's will, dignity, and the sense of self that allowed her to resist the rot's call, the pride she had set aside when facing Radan. What Millicent sought to return was not a physical object, but rather something far more fundamental, something she describes in her own words as Malenia's will, dignity, and sense of self. By unleashing the Scarlet Aeonia to defeat Radan, by setting aside the principles she had trained under and embracing the curse she had long resisted, Malenia appears to have lost something essential to who she was. Millicent sensed this absence, felt it in the essence they somehow shared, and believed that by completing her journey back to the Haligtree and offering her own resolution to the struggle against the rot, she might restore what had been sacrificed at Aeonia. The Tarnished, if they had helped Millicent throughout her journey, would eventually face a choice at the Haligtree. They could betray her, attacking when she was vulnerable in order to claim her unalloyed gold needle for their own purposes. Or they could stand back and allow her to complete her quest, to fulfill the purpose she had discovered within herself. If allowed to proceed, Millicent would remove her own needle, allowing the rot within her to bloom. In that blooming she would die, transformed into a scarlet Aeonia of her own, and her essence would rejoin the greater flower that Malenia had become. The Tarnished would receive the needle Millicent had carried, an unalloyed gold needle they could eventually return to Malenia's flower to receive Miquella's needle, a more powerful version that could suppress even the influence of the frenzied flame. The servants of Rot, those cultists and creatures who worshipped the outer god that had afflicted Malenia, held different views on her story and its ultimate meaning. Sage Gowry, a peculiar figure who served as adoptive father to Millicent and her sisters, spoke of Malenia as a goddess in waiting whose blooms represented stages in her ascension to true divinity. He believed that when her scarlet Aeonia bloomed 3 times, when she fully embraced rather than resisted the outer god's power, she would become a complete goddess of rot capable of ushering in a new age based on the cycle of decay and rebirth. From his perspective, Malenia's defeat at the hands of the Tarnished was not an ending, but another step in her transformation, and he eagerly anticipated her third and final bloom. The pests, strange creatures that infested the Lake of Rot and parts of Caelid, revered Malenia as their goddess and hoped desperately for her to bloom again so they could bask in her divine radiance. They built crude shrines to her memory, performed rituals designed to encourage more bloomings, and attacked anyone who approached the swamp of Ionia with intent they deemed hostile to their goddess. These creatures, neither fully insect nor fully humanoid, had been warped by the rot into new forms that existed solely to serve and worship the force that had created them. They viewed Malenia not as a tragic figure fighting against her curse, but as the embodiment of natural law, bringing decay and renewal to a world grown stagnant under the Golden Order's rigid control. But what did Malenia herself believe about her fate and purpose? The historical record preserves her actions, but not always her thoughts. Did she see herself as the outer god's instrument bringing necessary change, or as a figure forced to embrace the very curse she had fought against her entire life? Her final words suggest the latter, apologizing to Miquella for what she perceived as failure even in the moment of death, never claiming satisfaction in having become the goddess of Rot. She remained, even at the end, the blade of Miquella, defined by her service to her brother, rather than by the divine power she had inherited, or the cosmic curse that ravaged her flesh. Everything she did, every battle she fought, every victory she claimed, appears to have been in service to Miquella's vision, rather than any goal of her own. The shadow of the Erd Tree expansion would later reveal more about Miquella's true plans and nature, showing aspects of his character that cast his earlier actions in a different light. These revelations showed that Miquella had made promises to Radan about a vow of some kind, promises that might explain the words Malenia whispered as she bloomed at Ionia. The expansion raised questions about the nature of Miquella's power to compel affection and how it might have influenced those around him, though how deeply this affected Malenia's devotion remains a matter of interpretation. But these revelations came after Malenia's death, after her transformation into the eternal scarlet Ionia that bloomed at the Haligtree's roots, and there is no way to know how she would have reacted to learning these fuller truths about her brother's methods and ultimate goals. What remains undeniable, regardless of later revelations about Miquella's true nature, is that Malenia's story embodies certain truths about love, duty, and the costs of devotion. She was born cursed, marked from birth by forces beyond her control, and she fought against that curse with everything she possessed. When conventional methods failed, when skill and determination and her brother's gifts proved insufficient, she made the terrible choice to embrace what she had resisted, to become what she had feared, because the alternative meant abandoning her duty to the one person who had never abandoned her. It was heroic and tragic in equal measure, a life spent in service to another's dreams at the cost of her own peace. The rot that consumed Malenia, that eventually consumed much of Caelid and threatened to consume the Haligtree itself, served as physical manifestation of corruption and decay, but it also represented transformation, the breaking down of old structures to create conditions for new growth. The outer god of Rot preached a philosophy of decay and rebirth, of accepting that all things must eventually break down so that new things can emerge from the ruins. In that context, Malenia's blooming could be seen not just as tragic surrender, but as necessary destruction clearing the way for whatever comes next. the Golden Order's rigid certainties had failed to protect even its own children, leaving Malenia and Miquella cursed and suffering. Perhaps the only way forward required embracing forces the Golden Order had tried to suppress, accepting change even when it came wrapped in corruption. The lands between would never fully recover from what Malenia's blooms unleashed. Khalid remained a festering wasteland where the rot continued to spread despite the Redmane soldiers' best efforts at containment. Strange creatures twisted by the corruption wandered those scarlet swamps, some worshipping the force that had transformed them, while others simply suffered in confusion and pain. The Halik tree, though more resilient than ordinary vegetation, bore the scars of rot throughout its structure, beautiful and terrible in equal measure as golden wood intertwined with scarlet corruption. And the knowledge that 2 of the prophesied 3 blooms had already occurred meant that somewhere, somehow, the 3rd might still come to pass, completing Malenia's transformation into a true goddess of rot, with all the apocalyptic implications that carried. For those who actually fought Malenia in her boss arena, who experienced her legendary difficulty firsthand, she became something more than just a character in the Lands Between's history. She became a test, a wall that separated those with sufficient skill and determination from those who lacked either quality. Her waterfowl dance alone ended countless runs, forcing players to learn precise timing and positioning or find ways to mitigate or avoid the barrage entirely. Her healing on hit meant that mistakes didn't just cost health, they actively gave her advantage, requiring near-perfect play to overcome. And her second phase, with his rot build-up and phantom attacks and general increase in aggression, pushed even skilled players to their absolute limits. The community that formed around attempting and eventually overcoming Malenia became legendary in its own right. Players shared strategies and builds, discovered weaknesses and exploits, created challenge runs with increasingly restrictive rules. One player in particular, known as Let Me Solo Her, achieved internet fame by offering to help others defeat Malenia while wearing nothing but a jar on their head and wielding 2 katanas, a selfless act that embodied the cooperation from software games encouraged beneath their brutal difficulty. Malenia's fight became the benchmark by which all other difficult encounters were measured, the ultimate test that proved you had truly mastered Elden Ring's complex combat system. But beyond the gameplay challenge she represented, beyond the lore implications of her story, and the philosophical questions it raised about duty and corruption and transformation, Malenia resonated with players on a more personal level. Here was a character who was dealt perhaps the worst hand possible, cursed from birth with an affliction that should have killed her, or at minimum left her weak and helpless. She had every excuse to give up, to accept her fate and die quietly. Instead, she trained herself into perhaps the greatest warrior the Lands Between had ever seen, overcame disabilities that would have ended anyone else's combat career before it started, and fought on behalf of the brother she loved with such fierce devotion that death itself only briefly interrupted her vigil. She was tragic and inspiring in equal measure, a reminder that even impossible circumstances don't have to define you if you possess sufficient will to transcend them. Her design itself spoke volumes about the care from software put into creating her as a character. The prosthetic limbs were clearly artificial, yet moved with perfect fluidity, suggesting advanced craftsmanship but also raising questions about what it must have felt like to lose natural limbs to rot and have them replaced with golden metal. Her armor, elegant and practical in equal measure, bore the symbol of the Halik tree and showed wear from countless battles, while still maintaining an almost ceremonial quality. The massive katana she wielded, longer than she was tall, should have been unwieldy, but became an extension of her body in motion, each swing perfectly balanced despite the weapon's apparent awkwardness, and her face, when visible in cutscenes, showed the corruption spreading through her eyes even as it maintained a serene beauty that spoke to the person behind the curse. The voice acting brought additional depth to Malenia's character, conveying calm determination rather than aggressive hostility, even as she engaged in lethal combat. Her famous introduction line, "I am Malenia, blade of Miquella, and I have never known defeat," was delivered not as a boast, but a simple statement of fact by someone who saw her combat prowess as just another tool in service to her brother, rather than something to take personal pride in. When she spoke her final words, the pain and regret in her voice made it clear that her greatest concern, even in death, was not her own fate, but the fact that she had failed to protect Miquella, had been defeated when he most needed her to remain undefeated. The voice performance captured the tragedy of a person who had dedicated everything to another and felt that dedication wasn't enough. Malenia's influence extended beyond the immediate story of Elden Ring into the broader community and cultural conversation around From Software's games. She became an icon, recognizable even to those who had never played Elden Ring themselves. Her distinctive silhouette and infamous difficulty making her a symbol of the challenges these games present and the satisfaction of eventually overcoming them. Fan art depicting Malenia proliferated across the internet, some showing her in her full armor ready for battle, others imagining moments of vulnerability or alternate timelines where she was freed from her curse. Cosplayers recreated her distinctive appearance at conventions, crafting elaborate prosthetic limbs and finding ways to support the massive blade she carries. And streamers built entire content libraries around attempts to defeat her, showcasing both the frustration of repeated failure and the euphoria of eventual success. The reveal of Miquella's storyline in the shadow of the Erdtree expansion added new layers to Malenia's character and raised questions about whether her devotion had been genuine or influenced by her brother's ability to compel affection in others. Learning that Miquella had made promises to Radon about serving as consort in a new age, that perhaps the entire conflict between these two mighty warriors had been orchestrated as part of Miquella's plans to reach the Shadow Realm and undergo his own transformation, cast Malenia's whispered words at Aeonia in a darker light. Had she known what she was truly doing when she told Radon that Miquella awaited him? Had she been a willing participant in her brother's schemes? Or had she been manipulated like so many others who fell under Miquella's influence? These questions may never have definitive answers, as is often the case with From Software's deliberately ambiguous lore. But they add complexity to a character that was already among the most developed in the game. Malenia's story could be read as straightforward tragedy, a devoted sister who sacrificed everything for her brother, only to fail in the end. Or it could be seen as something darker, a cautionary tale about devotion taken to extremes and the dangers of serving another's vision so completely that you lose yourself in the process. Or perhaps both readings exist simultaneously, truth dependent on perspective and what aspects of her story one chooses to emphasize. What seems certain is that Malenia's tale will endure as long as people continue to play Elden Ring and explore the lands between. Future players will discover her as they delve into the Halig Tree, will struggle with her legendary difficulty, will piece together her backstory from item descriptions and NPC dialogue, just as current players have done. They will debate whether her choice to embrace the rot was heroic sacrifice or tragic failure. They will discuss what her relationship with Miquella meant, and whether her devotion was genuinely her own, or imposed through her brother's power. And they will remember her as one of the defining characters in a game filled with memorable figures. A warrior who transcended her curses through skill and determination, even as those same curses ultimately defined her fate. The complete story of Malenia, from cursed birth to training under the blind swordsman, from victorious campaigns through the shattering to catastrophic bloom at Aeonia, from dreamless sleep to final battle and transformation into eternal flower of rot, encompasses nearly every major theme Elden Ring explores. It touches on family bonds and their costs, on the corruption underlying divine authority, on the price of ambition and the weight of duty. It shows how even the mightiest warriors can be brought low by forces beyond their control, yet also demonstrates that transcendence is possible even in the face of impossible odds. Malenia fought her whole life against the rot within her, learned to channel and control it through martial perfection, and in the end accepted it fully to serve the one person she loved above all else. Whether that final acceptance represented victory or defeat, whether becoming the goddess of rot was the fulfillment of her destiny or the ultimate failure of everything she had worked toward, depends entirely on how one interprets the complex moral landscape of the lands between. In a world where gods can be monsters and monsters can be victims, where every act of creation requires destruction and every order eventually descends into corruption, perhaps there are no simple answers about what constitutes success or failure. There is only the story, endlessly complex and deliberately ambiguous, waiting for each player to piece together their own understanding from the fragments scattered throughout the game. And so, our tale comes to a close. Thank you for journeying with me tonight. If this story helped you rest, consider leaving a like. It helps other weary travelers find their way to our fireside. And remember, there are many more tales waiting for you here by the fire. Until next time, sleep peacefully and have a cozy night.